So I've turned the recording on. So welcome to the question and answer session held on September 15th, 2008 in regards to the proposed bylaws. We will be reviewing the bylaws today in English and doing the question and answer session in English only. Um, and What we will be reviewing to start with is the implementation plan, and then reviewing some key questions that James and I have already received, and then opening up the floor to pose questions via the webinar software for us to answer. I am unmuting every participant. I do ask you to mute yourselves unless there's an opportunity where you have to speak. Okay, so what I'm going to say is silence is assent when we do certain things. So the first thing that I'm going to ask is if everybody can see my screen okay. Oh, that's too big. There we go. And so the first thing that I want to highlight is that we do have the proposed bylaws available online to the entire membership through links provided through the newsletter, and also via social media and otherwise. It's also available on the AGM documents page in preparation for the AGM, and those bylaws are available both in English currently, and they're also available now in Spanish, which you can see on your screen right now. The Spanish ones were released today, and then the final translation, which will be French, is expected to be released within the next week. So the first thing that I wanted to do is I want to just quickly go over the implementation plan of when different bylaws are coming into effect, and most importantly, how they're being implemented and what some of the transitionary processes look like around that. A majority of them, they all come into effect in October 2018 when if the vote is yes for these proposed bylaws, but there is an implementation process as to when they come fully into effect. James, do you want to present this section so I'm not always talking?
Sure, I can present this. So Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are the Article 1 is the name of the organization, which is, I'm pretty sure, I think it's from memory, it's one line of the name of the organization will be Interpride, or the full name is the International Association of Pride Organizers. Article 2 is definitions. So there are definitions throughout the document that, we needed to clarify, and we wanted to put them in the old bylaws that were listed up front, and we liked the way that was formatted. So we kept those up there. We just had to update some definitions that are in there, but they will all go into effect if and when these pass in a couple weeks. Article 3 is the purpose that will go into effect as well, and Article 4 is the membership. The definitions of who the membership is, how they're defined, what levels of the membership are, and whatnot. Article 5 is a little more complicated because it is the board. So since we are actually having an election at this conference and the conference in Athens, we had to give some more definition about how the implementation would happen, because we also have regional directors that are going to be in place. So we want to make sure that those positions can fulfill their terms of office. So implementation for some of the bylaws, specifically for Article 5, the board, some of the terms will go into effect beginning in Athens. Any officers that are elected to office in Athens will be elected to a 3-year term to adjust us to going from an annual general meeting to a biannual general meeting every 2 years. And all the vice president of operations terms that are up for election in Athens will go to the new vice president positions, which we will discuss here. And then the remaining positions on the board will be opened up at the general meeting in 2020, which we have not determined that location. That'll be voted on here in Saskatoon. Article 6, the regions. There is no change in the definition about the regions or how the regions are structured. There's other things going on relating to the regions that'll be discussed separately. Article 7 is the Global Advisory Council. This entity is where the regional directors will move to. So they will no longer have the title of regional directors. They will have the global advisors, and they will. So this article replaces them. This article has a little more definition around it and implementation, because we can't just create the entity; it has to create itself. So the board will provide some structure to it, and then as individuals are elected to become the global representatives, they will determine their own structure and whatnot. So our plan is that once the bylaws are approved, we will start creating some basic structure for them between the AGM in 2018 and then 2019. And then the new Global Advisory Council will start creating its own structure and whatnot through until the general meeting in 2022. Article 8 is referring to the World Conference and General Meeting. So that'll take place. Those will take effect immediately, with the exception of the 2019 conference. And then the next time a bid will be opened we will open a bid to host the 2022 conference in 2020. We will not accept bids in Athens to host a general meeting. Article 9 is related to language. It'll go into effect immediately, but we will also continue to strive. We have a standing rule that says we will try to provide documents, services, and events in other languages based on our resources to be able to do so. Article 10, 11, 12, and 13, those all go into effect. Would all go into effect immediately. Certain bylaws will continue. Certain current bylaws would continue until their term of office is specifically the regional directors. So they will go into effect they will cease to be in effect as the regional directors either their term ends or until they resign or move into a different position, because some of these regional directors may move on to the Global Advisory Council, which is what we are anticipating for some of them. And that is the implementation plan. So I think that we'll take a time here for some questions.
Yes. Now, I've had a couple of people join since. I'm going to be unmuting you just now, but if you can mute yourself on your end, you do have the option to verbally pose a question or to type a question into the questions sections. Just allow me a moment to unmute the people who've joined. Please mute yourself once you've been unmuted. There we go. Are there any questions around the implementation plan?
I have one.
Okay.
Hello, this is Sue. I notice up above you have the regions going into effect October 2018. I wonder if there should be some kind of easing into that, and I'm just asking.
So the regions, as you're discussing around, and specifically, I'm trying to clarify if you're asking about the regional redistribution. Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Those are not held in the bylaws. Those are actually a separate standing rule. So the actual division of the regions is not determined in the bylaws themselves. How the regions get distributed is determined in the bylaws, the mechanisms in which they are distributed, but the actual names of the regions are not included. I'm just going to go to the bylaws just for a second and go to that section so that
Great.
we can do that, which I should have checked which article it was, sorry. It's
4.
Article 6.
4.
6. Um, where are you? Article 6. So as you can see, the section 1 of that article identifies the establishment of and reorganizations of regions and how that can occur, but it does not define the regions. It does identify how the Global Advisory Council and the board can define those regions and how the membership can do that. Section 2 talks about regional organization and identifies the requirement for 3 full member organizations to be present within a region. And then finally, Section 3 of that talks about board authority to administer underrepresented regions. So that's the part that comes into effect in October, not the organization of the regions.
Great. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay, just going back to the bylaw implementations. Any other questions just before we move? I'm just going to take a look here. Mark, I'll answer you by email later. It wasn't a question related to this. It was a question related to communicating this. Yes, we will be communicating this. It would be great to have it go out on the newsletter via the YouTube link, which I probably won't be able to get up today. I'll probably have it up tomorrow if that's possible. Let me know by email. Okay, so just before we move into the actual bylaws and going through the areas that we have received questions about, I just want to go to the one section about the continuing bylaw, Article 7 of the currently enacted bylaws. So basically, the reason why this one will continue is because these bylaws won't come into effect until they're voted. And we just had regional elections held in Europe for multiple regions. And so everyone who was elected there was elected on a 2-year term, as well as a number of regions also elect their regional director at the World Conference. An example of that is Region 7, which is Canada. So their regional directors will be determined in Saskatoon at the World Conference, which means that we will have regional directors that, as of the implementation of these proposed new bylaws, will still have a full 2-year period. We are not allowed to basically say their role no longer exists within the bylaws. And that article number 7 contains all the descriptors of what their job descriptions are, what their responsibilities are, what their authority is. And so that single bylaw will stand basically as a annex to the current bylaws with notations as to the fact that it is no longer a bylaw in action, but it is still a bylaw in enforcement related to specific roles. And so my expectation is the last time that bylaw will need to be used is October 2020, when any regional directors who are elected at this upcoming World Conference in Saskatoon complete their term. There are some other communications and strategies that Methods and Standards will have with the regional directors. We will likely call a meeting with the regional directors as a whole as Methods and Standards. to discuss this transition and what it looks like, so that they have a clear understanding of their role within the implementation of the new bylaws. Number one, in terms of disseminating the information to members, but also in terms of how it affects their roles on the board. So going to the actual bylaws document and scrolling to the top, we have had no questions regarding Article 1. We have had some questions regarding certain definitions in Article 2. Mainly, some of the questions that came up were around the concept of the Global Advisory Council and whether the word advisory was necessary or not. And at this point of time in the development of these bylaws, the development has occurred from basically November of last year until now, when the first public release of the first draft of changes was released in January. And so we haven't made that change at this time, but there was different questions around the use of the word advisory council or advisory. And at this point, that word has remained largely because this was the feedback and input that we had on these bylaws. And the one thing that I'd like to highlight is that bylaws are a living document. And so if there is a determination in a year or two that the word was unnecessary, the one thing about these bylaws is that it is easier to implement a change, in the sense that currently, under our current bylaws, you have 2 votes to make a change to the bylaws, but those 2 votes happen over 2 world conferences. So the first vote occurs, say, in Saskatoon this year under the current system. The first vote would occur here in Saskatoon, and you'd have to receive a majority vote, which would be 51% or greater vote. And then the following year in Athens, there would be the second vote where you would have to have what's called a supermajority or a 2/3 vote, where 67% or more would have to vote yes. Those 2 votes still exist under the current system, but the second vote, the 2/3 or greater vote, will actually occur within 30 days of the World Conference that the amendment was presented at, and it will be a vote of the entire membership done digitally. So that was one of the questions in that section. There were a few questions around the acronyms that were used, such as LGBTI, and also the acronym SOGIESC. And so those 2 acronyms are commonly used acronyms within the LGBTI human rights movement. They are also fairly common within the Pride movement. There is one acronym that has gained some traction, notably in the USA, which is LGBTQIA+, and it was not an acronym that actually was as common globally at this time. It doesn't mean that it won't that the acronym won't evolve to that direction, but that there is a potential for that process. And those were the primary questions that we received around the definitions. There was no primary questions that we received related to our purpose. We had some very minor changes in our purpose, but in general, it stayed very straightforward. We received no primary questions around the changes in the membership section, which again were generally minor in structure. We did receive a number of questions related to the board and its composition. Primarily, we received some questions around the choice of titles for the 7 vice president roles. And we had some questions around concerns around going from 5 vice presidents to 7 vice presidents. Currently, we have 5 vice presidents of operation, and we actually have 6. So one of the things that we had to explain to people asking this question is we have 5 vice presidents of operation, and we also have a vice president of membership. So it's only the increase um, of one vice president. And so a lot of those questions are primarily around people not having a clear vision of what the current executive structure looks like. And so the way that we will be addressing that is we'll be doing a visualization of the current executive committee structure compared to what will be the board structure. Once that question was clarified, most people very much thought that that the way that this was structured was very effective. The other question that we've received, and we're still defining a full answer, is about what the roles and responsibilities will be of the Vice President of Accessibility, Diversity, and Inclusion, specifically. And so the one change that we have made to the bylaws is we've actually pulled out the responsibilities of these specific roles, and we're moving them into a standing role. And we're doing that so that if there's a need to adapt those roles and responsibilities, that we're able to do that more effectively at the mid-year or at an in-person board meeting. Because the mid-year might be called something different moving forward in the structure. And so that was the primary question that we had in this area. The other question that came up was around the 4 Global Advisory Council representatives. And there was a number of people didn't realize the concept that those 4 Global Advisory Council representatives would be appointed to the board by the Global Advisory Council. So we're going to make sure to explain that in an effective way, probably through a visualization. I currently have Mark Chapman working on 2 visualizations related to the restructuring of the organization to create the Global Advisory Council. And those visualizations are very similar to the current ones that you see around the board in the middle, with all of the people around, basically like a table, and then the regions outside of them. They're utilizing that very familiar imagery to explain the shift. Those were the only questions we received in the section around the board at this time. And so being very aware that we are now approaching, Article 6, which is the regions, I'm going to open it back up and ask if anybody has any questions about Articles 1 through 5.
So Andrew, we did on the last restructuring phone call, we had some discussion about the term of office for these for the board members.
Okay, can you answer that?
Well, we during the discussion on the restructuring call, the question was, why are we going to 4-year terms for the members of the board versus 2-year terms? And we explained for the possibility of, with us going from an annual general meeting to a biannual general meeting, we would have the potential of, if all of the officers, with the exception of the co-presidents, were elected every 2 years, the possibility of electing almost an entire new board, with the exception of one co-president, was potential. Not likely, but potential. And we were working to try to maintain some continuity with the board, with also being that the officers will be staggered over 2 general meetings at a 50% ratio, as what's said here in Section 14B. It maintains what the current, I wouldn't say practice, but it has been the practice of this organization, I guess, that most officers in most roles, including co-presidents, stay on for a 4-year term anyway. Usually, very rarely has someone run for an office and not been reelected a second time. It's been rare. It has happened, but it's been rare. But then also there is an option here in section 14E that provides a confidential vote of affirmation by the membership that will take place just before the general meeting. So if you were elected to the board in 2020, say, before the general meeting in 2022, the membership would have the option to affirm they want you to remain on the board. So, and also there's always we had this discussion a couple of times. I think we had it on a previous bylaw, on a previous discussion call, that we can't, if someone has to resign due to personal issues or a change in their job or health concerns or whatever, we as an organization need to thank them for their service and then do our best to either re-elect someone or have the board appoint someone through the process that's already laid out. So that was the discussion. Sue, does that kind of cover it?
This is Perrin, and I was there, so if I can just add something in here. I was the one who had been particularly concerned about it because what I have seen in other organizations is that if you get elected to a 4-year term, partway through, there is often a case of a feeling of entitlement for the board, and I was concerned about that. James, upon reflection, as long as we have E in there with the affirmation, it bothers me less. But is there something in affirmation that talks about what vote it is that they must have to be retained? Is there something below E that I don't see right now? Is it a simple majority? Is it a supermajority? We don't talk about that.
So in that process and in that sense, that can actually, sorry that I'm popping in here, James, related to that vote of affirmation, we will be able to define what that vote looks like and what the requirements around that vote are and what those positives and negatives are. Like if somebody doesn't get a vote of affirmation, what occurs, and if somebody and what level of a vote is required for affirmation will be defined in a standing rule related to this section. So that can be addressed in a much more clear way. It will also have a specific procedure around it because of how that vote's going to be delivered prior to the general meeting.
Right, and so I think one of the things that, from my perspective, would be a selling point for this is if a draft of that standing rule were available to discuss as part of this presentation at this year's AGM, to say, for example, this is what we anticipate the standing rule might look like.
That is something that I'm sure me and James can do a draft of prior to the general meeting. Our primary focus this month has been on finalizing the translations and navigating that, but that is definitely something that we can work on within the presentation.
Right.
And this is a really good opportunity to highlight this, that at the World Conference and General Meeting in Saskatoon, James and I are going to be making ourselves available at specific time slots for all members to engage with us there to ask key. Maybe it's one simple question, maybe it's an area of major concern, maybe it's a collection of things that people want to discuss, maybe it's an idea that they had that they didn't think of until then. We will be available on Friday and on Saturday to have those discussions, and we will be presenting during the opening plenary that these proposed bylaws are being voted on at the general meeting, when they're being voted on, and when you're able to engage with James and I to ask key questions at the conference itself. Thank you so much for pulling out that I had missed that, James. So again, I'm going to open it up to the floor to ask if there were any other questions regarding Articles 1 through 5. Okay. So the next article we talked about a few minutes ago, which is the Article 6, which discusses regions. We have had a number of questions related to the regional distribution. Most notably, I had significant questions around regional redistribution and how that occurs when I was at the APOA conference. And so the one thing that James and I are going to highlight in a question and answer document, which will be attached to the bylaws for people to review, on any questions that anybody is emailing us or that is asked during this session, the question will be documented in that, and the answer from Methods and Standards will be included. So there will be two sources of information related to this, which is the video that will be produced from today's session and also that question and answer sheet. And so the main question that's been asked here is about the regional redistribution. So the bylaws don't contain the distribution of regions and how they are distributed. It contains only the mechanism in which they can be established and changed. So at this time, this bylaw proposal does not propose any changes to the regions. If a proposal to change regions is presented at the conference in Saskatoon, it will be a separate vote from the vote on the bylaws themselves. Global Advisory Council, we actually haven't received many questions about this. People think it's a really good idea. The primary question has been around why the use of the word advisory. The other question that has come up has been about why is there not more meat in this section as to how the Global Advisory Committee will operate? And the reason why that isn't here is because the Global Advisory Council will be a autonomous body that will be setting up its own rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations will be developed with input and support by the board, and there will also be the checking to make sure that aligns with all of the laws and legislation that our organization has to live up to. But it will be the role of the advisory council to develop those. And part of the work plan for Methods and Standards moving into the next year will be to support the Global Advisory Council in establishing those rules and regulations. And those will not be bylaws. They might be called regulations. They may be called standing rules. They may be called terms of reference. That is largely up to that body to decide. And so that's the primary question that we've had around the section of the bylaws on the Global Advisory Council. James, any other questions we've received around this section?
None that I am aware of. I think you've covered all of them.
Okay. James, why don't you take this section?
Okay, so Article 8, which refers to the World Conference and General Meeting, the primary changes here were it moves from annual, and we've gone through and scoured removing the word annual from this article. So instead of having the annual general meeting, we would have a general meeting every 2 years, at least once every 2 years. This is not to say that we could not have a general meeting once every year. There also could be, this also because the language is host a world conference, we've also kept that into mind because one of the rule requirements around World Pride is a human rights conference, and so it is the World Pride Human Rights Conference. That would not be like a membership meeting, but it is a conference of sorts. But this specific article is regarding primarily the general meeting. So this is regarding when we elect the board of the organization, when we make decisions about when and where the next general meeting will be, who will be the next World Pride host. Those are all things that are obviously in standing rules and will be in policies and procedures. But the main changes here were moving it from an annual general meeting to a general meeting at least once every 2 years.
The other,
if you can scroll down a little bit.
Yep. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Nope. Go ahead.
Those were all the changes in this article that I remember.
Okay. The only other question that we received around this article was actually a very targeted question, and it was a question related to the Business Associations Act. I may have misnamed that, but it's one of the acts in Texas that we fall under around incorporations that are registered like us and the requirements for general meetings. And the specific section of the act is 22 subsection 163. And it was discussing, there was a line in there related to a requirement for annual meetings. And so upon review of that, we've done some analysis and we've gotten some legal inputs. And that is a section with very specific requirements. So our organization is legally able to hold general meetings of the membership on a biannual basis, if that's what the membership has approved in the bylaws. But that is a question that came up, and it was a very specific question from a member who was very aware of some of the legislation that we fall under. So in this specific case, if the membership is voting to meet up to every 2 years, that is an acceptable process. Also, there is nothing within this bylaw that limits us from holding a general meeting of the membership in a different format. And that legislation allows meetings by email, it allows meetings by web conference, it allows meetings in person, it also allows meetings by documentation with a specific time requirement to submit votes. So an example of what would be classified as a general meeting might be when we do the affirmations vote for elected terms when they're halfway through. That would actually be considered a general meeting for the vote of affirmation, even though it was held digitally and it was held over a period of time. So it's partly about looking at the definition of how the law views general meetings nowadays. So we are fully compliant in this section under Texas law. The next section is languages. And so as you can see, the languages have added in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. It does not, however, say that they are operating languages or official languages of the organization, just languages that the organization utilizes. And so it does highlight for the first time in our bylaws that we are endeavoring, to make our organization more accessible to people who utilize these languages through interpretation and translation services, as they are fiscally responsible to the organization. And so within this, there was a question if there was a requirement to provide all documents, events, and activities in all 4 languages. And there is not a legal requirement under this article to do so.
J. Andrew, Dave Waite has a question.
Okay, what's Dave Waite's question?
It goes back a little ways, but you just saw my hand on regions.
Ah,
From what I thought I heard you say, we are not changing the regions, so Europe will still have 3 or 4 regions, and the U.S. will still have its 5 regions. Is that correct?
that is correct. So the U.S., if I remember correctly, has 6 regions. It has regions 1 through 6. Sue, am I correct on that? Or James, actually.
Yeah, that is correct.
Yes.
And we're not changing them right now, but we are moving the ability to change and reorganize them out of the bylaws to the standing rules?
It actually was never in the bylaws to change them. They've always been a standing rule, but that standing rule has always had a requirement to be approved by the whole membership. What is being changed here is that approval is by members in the affected regions only, with approval of the Global Advisory Council, and that if there's new regions created in that process, that it would have inputs from the board. And so right now we have 20 regions, and so that Global Advisory Council structure would be based upon those 20 regions. What's important to note here, though, is that whether we have 5 regions, whether we have 100 regions, it does not impact the number of voting positions on the board for our organization now, where currently with the structure of regional directors, how many regions we have impacts how many votes we have on the board. Because the way the regions now engage on the actual board is through the Global Advisory Council representatives.
I feel this is going to be really messy at the AGM. I was under this assumption that this was going to change, and it is what it is, I guess, but I think it's really going to make it messy, complicated, and sloppy at the AGM.
So the regional redistribution has never been a project of methods and standards. It has been a project that the restructuring committee has been diligently working on, and the restructuring committee may be presenting a recommendation at this World Conference and General Meeting. That I'm not aware of. I'll allow Sue to speak to that, being aware that this is a question and answer session for the bylaws. So for the bylaws, the regions were not previously established in the bylaws, and it was over the feedback from the past year, including the 3 consultation sessions, there was not a recommendation to structure the regions inside of the bylaws because of the limitation of the 2-vote requirement. Because currently, in the current system that we're currently under right now, they are held in a standing rule that's approved by the membership in the similar way that membership dues are held in a standing rule that are approved by the membership.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and Dave, we are presenting the revised regions to the membership through restructuring.
Okay, I'm going to scroll back down to financial matters. So financial matters, we actually made relatively no changes. We were actually in a very good position under our previous bylaws when it comes to financial matters of the organization, and we've received no questions in this area. This area does cover us around ensuring that the organization does not take out more money than it's able to handle in terms of debt. It does prevent all different types of activities that could be viewed as negative for the organization, and it does ensure financial transparency as well. The next is still somewhat financial, but it's related to assets, and it does highlight the different requirements of being a 501c3 related to distribution of assets upon dissolution, and other situations. No significant changes in this area, and we've received no questions. We have received some questions around the amendment section, primarily in 2 questions. Oh, go ahead.
And I know you don't really want to make changes, but I'd like to recommend one where it talks about the, even though that paragraph talks about Texas, it talks about the IRS. I think it should relate back to the United States' IRS code. I think that should be put in there so someone isn't wondering from some other part of the world, what is this Internal Revenue Code?
Okay, that is a potential minor addition that we can highlight, that it's related to the US Internal Revenue Code. We do highlight around legislation and laws in a section further down which laws we fall under. So that may provide the clarification, but it might be useful for us to put a notation under section 3 to highlight that the Internal Revenue Code is a U.S. legislation that the organization falls under, and that wouldn't require any further amendment. It would simply be a notation or an asterisk.
Thank you for looking into that.
Okay. So under the amendments, the two primary questions that we've had is around the structure of submitting amendments 60 days prior. Really what that is doing is it's addressing two things. It's addressing the fact that it allows people to really well develop any bylaw amendments that they're recommending, and so that they're well planned and well processed. One of the things that Methods and Standards intends to do prior to future general meetings and world conferences is about 6 months out, send out a call to membership related to a bylaw amendments workshop that it'll hold. So that if there is an interest in presenting a proposed amendment, there would be a direct support in how to do that, which would also then support the people proposing the amendment to submit effectively 60 days prior. The other question has been around the way that those amendments will be adopted through still 2 votes, but the second vote taking place within 60 days of the general meeting that the first vote occurred. That second vote will actually be a 2/3 majority vote of the membership, and it will be a vote that will be digitally sent out to the members 60 days after the World Conference. And so one of the questions that's been received about that is, how do we ensure people aren't voting twice? So the reality is everybody is invited to be able to vote twice. You have a right to vote at the World Conference and General Meeting for the first vote of the bylaw amendment that's being proposed, and then you're invited for the second vote. Everybody is already entitled to vote twice, and so everybody will be receiving equal opportunity to vote twice. One of the changes in these bylaws is there is a potential for the organization to offer opportunities to digitally vote during world conferences, or at least there is no limitation on us investigating that opportunity. But there is no requirements in the bylaws that we provide an option for everybody to be able to vote at a world conference, whether they're in attendance or not. So those are the two primary questions that we've had around amendments. Do we have any questions?
So,
oh, go ahead.
Andrew, to clarify, the second vote would be over the course of 60 days. So we would open those second votes shortly after the conference closes, and we would provide the membership, because we understand also in some parts of the world, it may be difficult for them to get at. They don't have they're not as connected as, some parts of the world. So we want to, that's why we're opening it up for 60 days. We would also, this would be incumbent upon the Methods and Standards Committee to work directly with the Member Services Committee to ensure that, one organization, one vote, and whatnot. So we would be able to use whatever format or software that we would have for that. Would probably be a very specific link for each organization or something that they would have to follow. So.
And Methods and Standards is currently investigating what types of digital voting softwares that we can utilize that will be effective for this process and also cost effective for the organization. And there are multiple options for how to do that effectively. That's not a decision, though, that we have to make in this instance, because there are many, many options on how to do this effectively. So we're now finished Article 12, and I haven't opened up to the floor since Article 5 whether there's any questions really outside of the regional section, which was Section 6. So I want to ask if anybody has any questions related to any of the articles that we've covered that have come up since we've been discussing. And you can submit either by submitting questions, which I'm looking at, or by raising your hand, which Sue is looking at, thank you, or by verbalizing the question. Okay. James, can I get you to read Article 13, which is the last one?
Okay, Article 13, governing law and jurisdiction. So there have been absolutely no changes here, and to my knowledge, I have not received any questions here. So Section 1 is governing law. These bylaws shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Texas and the United States, whose courts shall be deemed those of competent jurisdiction. And then Section 2 is the subordination. We will be read in conjunction with, shall be subordinate to, and should a conflict exist, give way to the Articles of Incorporation. So there has been no changes here. These are standard. I can see Dave's point about going up into the Internal Revenue Code. I can see like an asterisk or something there, because when we print these or put them into the final format, they might not be on the same page. So
yes, that's true. And so we will put an asterisk on that one, Dave, because that won't involve significant changes. The other thing is that, so there's two things to highlight. One is around the way these bylaws will be put together if and when they are approved at the Saskatoon AGM. So these will be a document on their own. What we have previously called the Methods and Standards Guide will actually be split moving forward into 4 key document areas. It currently already is these areas, but it's all in one document, and that confuses some individuals at times. So there will be the bylaws, there will then be the standing rules, and then there will be policies, and then finally procedures. And so those will be the 4 documents basically of how Interpride operates. In terms of the bylaws, if and when they are approved, they will be published into a PDF format that will actually include a table of contents that will be hyperlinked to the different sections. Also, there are different areas within the bylaws that reference each other. As an example, maybe somewhere references Article 2, Section N, as an example. Those sections will be hyperlinked so that you'll be able to go and look at that specific section to predetermine. And also any of the external references, such as the Internal Revenue Code, we will actually provide a hyperlink to that actual code. So that if people wanted to take a look at it, they can, which is something that previously hasn't happened in the way that we produce these documents. So the last question that we've had that's come from a few individuals has been, how are these being presented on the floor, and what's going to go on? So first and foremost, we will on Friday be reminding all members who are present at the conference at the opening plenary that this vote is occurring. When this vote occurs, there will be an opportunity presented for 5 questions that haven't been posed in the question and answer session, or that haven't been documented in the question and answer document that's been available to everybody. We will remind everybody that those documents are available. And so those 5 questions will be allowed to be posed on the floor. And then these bylaws will go for a vote directly after those 5 questions. Because the bylaws have had to be reviewed by legal counsel in order to assure that they comply with the laws that we're required to comply with, there won't be any floor level amendments on these bylaws. There's been an opportunity for members to provide amendments and suggestions on them at multiple points throughout their development, notably the 3 consultation sessions that we've had, and also the open document that's been available to all members to provide suggestion and input since January, which we've received significant suggestions and inputs. So we will be detailing how much input we've received, from how many member organizations we've received it from, and from how many individuals we've received it from out of those member organizations, so that people have an understanding of how much engagement has occurred. But primarily because of the requirement to have these legally reviewed, there will be no floor level amendments. And I'm going to open up for one last opportunity for everybody to ask any questions. And if there are no further questions, we will call this session to a close.
This is Perrin. I raised my hand, but since you're asking, question on the 5 questions from the floor.
Yep.
Knowing how often people don't read all the documents that are available to them, including me being one of the guilty parties this last time, is there someone who can quickly vet the questions before they're asked from the floor, rather than getting into a, well, that question's been asked, we're not going to answer it kind of thing?
Yes, we will be vetting. The other thing that we're arranging is we're arranging to have a copy of these proposed bylaws, the question and answer document, and the implementation plan. Everybody will receive one of those in their language of preference at the start of the AGM. So we're actually having those printed so everybody has a physical copy of them when they're in Saskatoon, in their language of preference out of English, Spanish, or French. The next thing is that related to those 5 questions, when James and I are doing the presentation where these are coming up for a vote, one of us will be out in the audience, and there will likely be an announcement shortly before that it's occurring. And so there will be an opportunity, if people ask questions, that whichever one of us will be out in the audience will quickly do a vet of those questions that are potentially being proposed to prevent any duplication of questions.
Thank you.
So, Jay Andrew, we have a question from Dot.
Okay.
She says, back on the amendments, you stated everyone votes. I assume you mean 1 vote per organization.
Thank you, Dot. Yes, I do mean 1 vote per organization. Everyone was a bad choice of words. The vote is by member organizations who are full members, which means that they've held a Pride event within the past 18 months in order to be full members and not associate or provisional members. So it would be 1 vote per member organization on both of those votes for amendment.
Great. I don't have any other questions through the system.
I don't have any either, so I want to say thank you to everybody for attending today. And if anything comes up that you think of in the next coming weeks, please email James or I. My email at Interpride is andrew.baker@interpride.org. James can share his, and you can also email us at methodsandstandards@interpride.org, if I remember correctly as well.
So my email is probably the longest one you'll ever hear, james.hermansen-parker, HERMANSEN-PARKER @interpride.org.
And I want to say thank you to everybody so much for attending this session, and you all have a wonderful Saturday or Sunday morning, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining.
Bye, guys.
Bye.